Meeting of Wednesday, September 14th, 2022. The meeting is now called to order, and staff, would you please call the roll?
Thank you. Commissioner Thomas. She's here. She's waving at us. Commissioner Tivana.
Here.
Commissioner Raspy.
Here.
Commissioner Janoff.
Here.
Commissioner Clark.
Here.
Vice Chair Barnett.
Here.
And Chair Hansen.
And I'm here as well. And staff, we're still doing the rules of civility and decorum for our meetings, so I will leave it with you.
The public is welcome to participate in the meetings, understanding that the purpose of the meeting is to conduct the important business of the town in an efficient and effective manner. For the benefit of the entire community, the town of Los Gatos asks that all speakers follow the town's meeting guidelines by treating everyone with respect and dignity. This is done by following meeting guidelines set forth in state law, in the town code, and on the cover sheet of the agenda. The town embraces diversity and strongly condemns hate speech and offensive hateful language or racial intolerance of any kind at board, commission, or committee meetings. Town council and staff are well aware of the public's right to disagree with their professional opinion on various town issues. However, antisocial behavior, slander, hatred, and bigotry statements are completely unacceptable and will not be tolerated in any way, shape, or form at board, commission, or committee meetings. All public comments at the board, commission, or committee meeting must pertain to items within the subject matter jurisdiction of the town and shall not contain slanderous statements, hatred, and bigotry against non-public officials. The town will go through the following steps if a disturbance results from a member of the public not following these rules. If participating remotely, town staff may mute the individual with an explanation for the record of why muting occurred consistent with this policy. If participating in person, the chair may call a recess for violation of this policy, resulting in the immediate cessation of the audio and video recording and the commissioners exiting the chamber or meeting room. Staff will determine if the individual should be removed or if all members of the public should leave, depending on the extent of the disturbance. In the event that all public members exit, only the press would be allowed back in the meeting. Once the individual or individuals leave, the commissioners would return to the chamber or meeting room and the chair would resume the meeting. Persons disrupting a board, commission, or committee meeting may be cited for violation of the California Penal Code, Section 403.
And thank you very much for that. And so we will go ahead and move on to the next item on the agenda, which is verbal communications. And the town of Los Gatos and the Planning Commission and all the citizens of Los Gatos encourage public participation in our meetings. That participation can take a couple of forms. One is written communications that are received prior to the meeting through staff are always welcome and helpful to this Planning Commission. And in addition, we have 2 opportunities to participate in verbal communications during this meeting. The first is now we have verbal communications, which is where members of the public can speak on items that are not on the agenda. And then also during the hearing of a specific item, we include public comments on that particular item when that item is being discussed. So we do encourage public participation. We do, however, ask you to limit your comments to 3 minutes. And we ask that you would state your name and address for the record. However, you can also choose to speak anonymously. So I'd like to find out if there are any members of the public that would like to speak on items not on the agenda for this meeting. Then please do raise your hand.
Yes, please raise your hand if you wish to speak on an item that is not on the agenda today. Chair, I don't see any hands raised.
Okay, very good. Then we will go on and go to the next item on the agenda, which is the consent calendar. Any member of the public or the Planning Commission may pull an item that's on the consent calendar for discussion during the regular meeting. However, for this particular meeting, the only item on the consent calendar is the minutes for our meeting. And I have a quick question for staff. We did have a request for a continuance, but we're going to do that as a regular hearing, or should I consider it as part of consent calendar?
I recommend doing it when the item comes up as a public hearing.
Very good. Thank you. So we do have just one item on the consent calendar, which is the minutes of our last Planning Commission meeting on Wednesday, August 24th. Are there any members of the public or commission that would like to pull this item? I don't see any hands. Are there any recommended changes from commissioners to the Planning Commission minutes before we take a motion? Don't see any hands raised. So can I get a motion for approval of the consent calendar? Commissioner Thomas.
I move to approve the consent items, including draft minutes of the August 24th meeting.
Very good. And can I get a second as well? Commissioner Tabana.
I'll second that.
Okay, very good. So then we will do our roll call vote, and please answer yes, no, or hopefully not abstain, but if you feel you must, then that is an option as well. So I'll start with Commissioner Tabana.
Yes.
Commissioner Thomas.
Yes.
Commissioner Raspy.
Yes.
Commissioner Janoff.
Yes.
Commissioner Clark.
Yes.
Vice Chair Barnett.
I approve items 1 and 2 on the consent calendar minutes, but not as to item 2, which was on Wedgewood Drive, as to which I recused myself.
Okay, thank you for that. And I vote yes as well. And staff, how do I consider that? Is that a full approval, or is that a partial?
I recommend that we consider it a recusal for the full consent calendar.
Okay, then we will just consider it a recusal from the consent calendar, and it passes unanimously for the commissioners that are able to vote on it without being recused. So then we will go ahead and move on to the next item on the agenda, which is item 2. And item 2 is a request for to appeal a denial of a fence height exception request on Blossom Hill Road. And we did receive a letter from the applicant requesting that this item be continued to a future meeting. They suggested some dates. I'm going to ask for staff's guidance. Do we bring up those dates at this point in time, or see if there's any discussion, or
so I'll chime in. So if the commission selects a specific date, the item won't need to be renoticed. And so I imagine I'll defer to the planning manager, but I imagine it'd be helpful if the planning commission selected a specific date to which to continue the item.
Okay. And staff, I don't have that item pulled up in front of me. Can you let us know the specific dates that they suggested?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question. The applicant for the project at 755 Blossom Hill Road is requesting a continuance to November 9th, and staff does support and recommend that the planning commission do so.
Okay. And so that is the request from the applicant to give themselves more time. They did outline multiple reasons in their request for wanting the continuance. Are there any commissioners that have comments that they'd like to make or would like to make a motion to approve? Commissioner Raspy.
Thank you, Chair. I support applicant's motion, given especially that staff has voiced disapproval for the same. And so if the commission is ready, I'll go ahead and make a motion to that effect.
Go ahead.
I move to continue the hearing on the appeal of Community Development Director decision to deny a fence height exception request for construction of 6-foot tall fencing located within the required front setback and construction of a vehicular gate with reduced setbacks on property zoned R-1:10 located at 75 Blossom Hill Road to the date certain of November 9, 2022.
Thank you for that. And is there a second? Is Vice Chair, is that you?
Yes, I'd second motion.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. And is there any discussion by commissioners? Commissioner Thomas?
I have a question for staff. I just want to know if we are going to be getting a new staff report or if we'll get it the same staff report for this meeting, when we continuance, if we pass this continuance. You know what I
Thank
mean?
you. Yes, thank you for that question. We would ask that you retain the staff report that you have. If additional information is provided, we will provide an additional staff report, but it would be in addition to what you've already received. Most likely it will be a very brief report stating that it was brought on this date and that it was continued, if that is the will of the commission.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that being the case, we have a motion and a second, and we will again do our roll call vote. And I will start with Commissioner Clark.
Yes.
And then Commissioner Janoff,
Yes.
Commissioner Raspy,
Yes.
Commissioner Thomas,
Yes.
and Commissioner Tabana.
Yes.
And then Vice Chair Barnett.
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. So the motion passes unanimously. And staff, are there any appeal rights for this action by the commission?
No, there are not.
Okay, thank you for that. And so then we can move on to the main item on our agenda for this evening, which is item 3, which is the continuance of our review of the draft objective standards. And I will ask Ms. Armour if you would like to make a staff report or if one of these other staff members would as well.
Thank you, Chair. I will pass that off to Mr. Safdie to make the staff report.
Thank you and good afternoon. Before you tonight is the continued review of the draft objective standards for recommendation to the Town Council. On June 22nd, the Planning Commission reviewed the first draft document and provided input to staff on recommended modifications. Following that meeting, staff and our consultant, M Group, considered the direction from the Planning Commission and prepared a revised draft document. On August 24th, the Planning Commission received public comment on the revised draft, including input from the local architect community. The discussion was continued to tonight's hearing to allow the architect community additional time to provide written comments to be reviewed. The written comments from the architects are provided as Exhibit 16 with this staff report. Additional public comment and commissioner comments were also included with that report. Staff prepared written responses to the architects community or the architects comments, which were included as Exhibit 19 of yesterday's addendum report. The addendum report also included additional public comment provided as Exhibit 20. Staff, along with our consultant, look forward to the discussion this evening and are happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay, and do any commissioners have questions for staff? Okay, I don't see anyone with any questions. Okay, so we have a number of comments that we received from one of our board members from the Housing Element Advisory Board, also from the vice chair, from Ms. Quintana, and then also the response to the architect's comments. Staff, you had some particular items that you wanted us to go over first.
Thank you,
Yes, Ms.
Chair.
Armour.
Through the chair, I would recommend that we do open the public hearing and hear from comments from the public, since there has been additional materials provided. And then we can go through, we have provided some staff guidance and feedback on the items that were provided by the architects community. And so if there are items there that the commission wishes to include in their recommendation to town council, we could go through those. We did number them in the attachment that includes staff's responses. Plus we did call out a few particular items in the addendum report, in addition to what had been provided in your previous staff reports.
Okay, So then I think that's a good suggestion. Let's see if this would be the verbal communication section for this particular item. And so I'd like to find out if any members of the public would like to speak on this item, which is the draft objective standards.
If anyone would like to speak on this item, would invite you to raise your hand now. We'll give them just a moment, just in case anyone does wish to speak. I'm not seeing, oh, I am seeing a hand raised. Okay, just a moment. All right, Ms. Quintana, you may speak. You have up to 3 minutes.
Thank you. I think there are some items that I may not have read already, but in any case, I'd like to speak on 3 different items that I did not cover in my initial submission for the addendum, and that covers illustrations, private and common open space and landscaping, and whether the one-size-fits-all approach is appropriate. I'm just going to be very brief, and if you have any questions, you can ask me, or I will submit additional comments when I see the final draft that goes to the council. As far as illustration goes, I know that the architects favor line drawings. However, the line drawings provided in the draft standards are at some points hard to understand by most people who aren't architects or planners, and they tend to appear to be favoring very boxy construction. I understand the difficulty with photos. However, this is my compromise suggestion. The city of Palo Alto has used line drawings, but the line drawings are limited to illustrating only the standard that's being stated, not an entire building, so that it doesn't tend to indicate, it's more neutral towards architecture and mass and scale. As far as photos go, I think they are really helpful for the general public to understand, but I understand the problem with them. So my suggestion is that maybe there be a page that just has a collage of various different buildings, not one for every standard, but a group of buildings that staff feels meets the intent of the standards. So that's my comments on that. On the private and public open space, I'm a little confused there. If landscaping doesn't count towards common open space for the common space, and there's landscaping in that space, how does that work? I'm just confused. And also, there seemed to be a dichotomy of opinion from the group of architects and the other architect who commented on the size of private open space as well as common open space. And it seems to me that maybe they're talking about 2 different things. I think the architects are wanting more leeway to appeal to the high end of the housing market. I think the other architect may be actually addressing his remarks to smaller units, which is the intent of this whole process.
Ms. Quintana, Ms. Armour has her hand up, and I suspect it's because your 3 minutes are up.
Okay.
But let me see if any commissioners have questions for you. And I do want to thank you on behalf of the commission for submitting all the comments that you have already and helping participate in this process to move this important item along. So do any commissioners have questions for Ms. Quintana?
Oh, wonderful.
Okay. Maybe I think some of the things you're bringing up are going to be discussed in any event. So we appreciate everything that you've told us so far. And please continue to send in your comments to us as well. Is there anyone else that would like to speak on this item?
If anyone else would like to speak on this item, please raise your hand now. I don't see any hands raised.
Okay. All right. Well, so then I'm going to close public comments, and then this would be the time where the commission can will discuss the items that have been brought up so far as comments and try and get some resolution so that we can make a recommendation to town council. So I thought that it might be helpful to start with the staff packet. They did provide some items that they wanted us to discuss. And we did discuss some of these before, but maybe we can close on them and hopefully use them as a recommendation to forward this document along. So I'm going by the staff report where they list staff requires direction from the Planning Commission on the following. And so the first one is a comprehensive standalone document. Staff's recommendation was in the past and continues to be that to use instead of going through the massive effort that it would take to take all of the objective standards in every document that we have in town and put them in one, that instead to include a list of applicable documents. And so that's what they would like to do. I want to see if any commissioners had any thoughts or comments on this. Commissioner Raspy.
Thank you, Chair. To me, the town staff's position seems eminently logical, and I can't think of a reason that we would want to attack it any differently. So unless somebody feels differently, I would recommend to town council to follow staff's recommendation on this issue.
Okay, I thank you for the input. Anyone else that has any thoughts on that? That was my feeling as well, that we had talked about this before, and also, in our preparatory meeting for this meeting, we discussed it again, and it would be a very long and complex process to do that, and especially with documents getting updated. It's probably best to have references to the other documents. So if no one has any objection to going in that direction, I'm going to say that we follow staff's recommendation on that. And I don't see anyone saying, let's not do that. Okay, so item B is removal of the term design throughout the document. The public comment requests that the text throughout be changed from objective design standards to objective standards, and no explanation was given. So staff, I'm going to ask, does that mean you don't, since there's no explanation, you don't have a recommendation?
Thank you, Chair. We would recommend continuing with the document being named and it labeled as it currently is, since we don't have a reason to change and remove the word design.
I apologize, that was my dog. Hold on. Okay, so I personally looked at this and I didn't, without an explanation of why it would make a big difference in the document, and knowing that it would be a lot of trouble to change it, my suggestion would be not to do that. Are there any commissioners that have any comments? Okay, so then I will assume that that one is okay with everyone. And so item C was decreased tree spacing. The public comment requests that the spacing between trees within parking lots be reduced. Right now, the standard reads that one tree between every 10 consecutive parking stalls when there are more than 15 parking stalls. And the public comment requests to reduce the number of spaces below 10. And staff does not recommend this change as it was included with consistency for the town code, which I assume to mean that we would need to amend the town code as well. So are there any comments on this item? Commissioner Raspy.
Thank you, Chair. I would again agree with staff on this one for a couple of reasons. First being consistency throughout the town documents, but Also for the supplemental reason that I think we're all aware, water is becoming a bigger issue in California as every day goes by. And so to the extent that we call for less planting of trees, perhaps maybe that's an issue we should keep in our minds as we plan our town forward. So keeping the spacing at 10 feet rather than closer together, I think makes sense for a variety of reasons.
Okay, no, and thank you for that comment. Any other comments from commissioners on this item? And if there's no objections, I will just assume that we're going to go with staff's recommendations. Okay, and let me just stop and ask staff, do you need us to vote on these, or is it okay to go with consensus?
No, consensus is fine, in my opinion, but I will defer to the town attorney if she thinks otherwise.
I agree. And then the commission's decision will be reflected when you vote on making a recommendation to the town council.
And in particular, when the recommendation is for a change that the commission is not making, then that's just fine. You're just not going to make that additional change.
Okay, so we can move on to and thank you for the clarification. We can move on to D, which is a format change for B-4 or B.4.3. And the comment requests that the format be changed so it is consistent with the rest of the document. The draft objective standard contains a menu of options of architectural solutions to achieve 16 points. We discussed this at the subcommittee level. Vice Chair Barnett and I were on that subcommittee, and the Planning Commission previous discussion, it was received with support. But I believe the architects, and maybe there was others that commented that it might be too confusing. But there was in one of the first submission that we had from staff, they did take some buildings in town and give an example of how you can meet the 16-point standard. So we should at least decide whether or not to go to a different approach or leave it the way it is. And staff, let me just check that I am characterizing this correctly in terms of the way you want input.
That is correct. Thank you for the question. One thing to clarify, the architect community didn't have concerns with the format of it. They had more concerns about the valuation and the different architectural details listed within that list.
Okay. Well, then was the public comment that we got from someone else that said that the 16-point? Yes,
that is correct. Yes. And
okay.
So then there is further discussion of B4.3 in item that we numbered 22, where we respond to the architect's comments. So
we can come back to the
this
specificity of it when we discuss the architect's comments then. So the question on the table is whether or not we abandon the 16-point system and try to go for something else. So I'd like to get comments on that, and keeping in mind that this was recommended and previously by the subcommittee, and then our previous discussion was that this was fine to move forward with. But if there's some new information or something that people would like to bring up right now, let's do that. Commissioner Janot.
Excuse me. Thank you. I'm comfortable with the format and look forward to discussing the architect's concerns when we get to that portion of the agenda. But I think it's a very helpful list, and the illustrations that staff provided were also very helpful. And if those are intended to be continued in the draft that goes forward, I think that's a good approach.
Okay, very good. Okay, so if there's no objections, the proposal on the table is to leave the 16-point system as is, and then there might be the potential of modifying for clarity some of the actual things that are scored for points, and we'll discuss that later. Okay, and then we're going to return to the discussion about privacy that we had at the last meeting. And Vice Chair Barnett submitted some information from the Palo Alto objective standards that were included with our August 24th addendum report. And the general consensus at the hearing was not to increase privacy standards. However, Vice Chair Barnett did submit additional comments to express concerns that the standard remains subjective, What it says is balconies facing residential uses on abutting parcels are allowed when the design is proven to prevent views to residential use. And the issue is whether or not this can really be an objective standard, because somebody would have to determine how it affected views to residential use, and it's not a thing that that everyone would agree on. So I think this would be a good time to discuss this and see if we can, come up with a direction that's comfortable for the commission for recommendation. And Vice Chair Barnett did submit some additional comments. And I'm going to, he has his hand up, so why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. I think my submission is clear, but I did think of one other possibility for us to handle it, which is to have no standard at all with respect to privacy from balconies as to adjacent residences and their lots. But submit that as a possibility for consideration. Otherwise, I think we have to not necessarily mirror what Palo Alto did, but follow something that is in fact objective. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Janoff.
Thank you. Vice Chair Barnett recommended that the town attorney weigh in as to an opinion whether this particular standard is objective, and so I'd like to hear from the town attorney.
I do agree with Commissioner Barnett's comment. The state is interpreting, the term objective standard very, very, very narrowly. In my former jurisdiction, there was a requirement for step backs, and the court held that it was not sufficiently objective because the city didn't specify how long the setback was supposed to be, the step back, sorry. So yeah, to the extent that we can put numbers on it or talk about the angle of the balcony or anything that will make it so that there's no argument that it's not an objective standard, I think that will make it more defensible.
So if I have a follow-up, if I may?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Would you agree that, so I was looking at Vice Chair Barnett's recommendations, and I thought if in fact what we have in the current draft is not considered to be objective, as you state, then it seemed reasonable to me to include the first couple of his points that within 30 feet of residential windows, that's a specific number, and then item parentheses small I. So I thought those looked like reasonable things to include. And then I thought the balance of the parenthetical items below the first point were a matter of how staff would review the data to determine whether the standard had been met. So I didn't think that was necessary to include in this document. But if the other commissioners would like to keep this item in the draft objectives, I think it's an important one to include. We have a lot of discussion around balconies and visibility. So I personally would like to see it included. And I think Vice Chair Barnett's, I don't have the document in front of me, but the sentence that talks about the 30 feet and then the first bullet underneath that are reasonable to include as specific objectives that are measurable.
Very good. Thank you for that, Commissioner Janoff and Commissioner Respi.
Thank you, Chair. In reviewing this again, I agree with Commissioner Barnett's point, and I think staff supports the point that as currently drafted, it's interjects a level of subjectiveness into it. And so I think Commissioner Janoff's suggested a reasonable solution. As I was looking at it, I had a simpler one. And again, maybe town attorney can weigh in if it helps, but I think the problematic phrase seems to be the design is proven to prevent views. If we maybe simplify that to just simply say when the design prevents views, isn't that suddenly become objective rather than subjective and solve the problem? Maybe a simpler way to address the problem. I just throw it out for consideration by the commission.
I can offer.
Well, I think the town attorney, that would be good to weigh in about whether or not that would make it more objective.
Given how the state and the courts are interpreting the term objective, I would recommend that the town adopt something more specific than prevents views, because I do think an argument could be made that, that's in the eye of the beholder. But something like, is not visible from the balcony, like that can't be argued about. Like, that is objective. It is not visible. So a standard that there's only one way to apply it is what will work in the end. I hope that
Yes, that helps. Commissioner Tavana has a comment as well.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. As I mentioned last time at the previous meeting discussing this topic, I do think privacy is a very tricky subject because I believe it is inherently subjective. I think one person you can't, it's subjective in nature. I don't think you can put it on paper and say this is privacy because it could be to one person that's not private, to one person it could be private. So I didn't think of this possibility, but I do like Vice Chair Barnett's comment to maybe just remove the section altogether. I think that would clarify it, and it could be on a case-by-case basis moving forward, just to keep it simple, because I do think this will crop, when these projects do come up, it will crop up and be a point of contention during the process.
Okay, no, thank you for that, Commissioner Tavana, and Commissioner Thomas has a comment as well. So.
Thank you, Chair. I agree that it is really difficult to make an objective standard around privacy because privacy is not inherently objective. So I agree with some of Commissioner Tavana's sentiment that it just is not something that we can maybe make an objective standard on to guarantee privacy. So therefore, should we put one in? I also recognize that people in town value privacy. And I know that that is something that is important. So I think that we have been making our best effort, and I am willing to attempt to adopt something. But I think that even if we adopt something like that is specific, like 30 feet, I guess that gives some sort of standard, but I do think that there are still going to be people that argue that that's not private enough for them. And I think that that's, for me personally, that is a major concern. And I know that in my short time here on the Planning Commission, we have had a lot of people come to us. We see a lot of things that are related to privacy and privacy concerns, and that's connected back to how safe people feel. And I don't know if we can make an objective standard that the outcome will be that people feel that they have privacy and safety and feel safe because of that. So I am interested to hear what other commissioners think, but at this point in time, I'm not sure that we can come up with a standard that will be upheld in the courts. And also, I'm seeing some hands go up. Okay, that's good. That will be upheld in the courts and that can guarantee some level of privacy, what people will accept as being private or privacy.
Okay, thank you for that, Commissioner Thomas. And our consultant, Mr. Ford, has his camera on, so I'm assuming that you are able to comment on this.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner, Chairperson. I read Commissioner Barnett's comments 3 weeks ago, and I also read them this past weekend at the new submittal. And so I found it very interesting. Both times I went and looked at that specific Palo Alto ordinance. And what I would recommend, and I did this, and I think it showed up in the staff addendum, is to keep the standard B.4.1, but delete the sentence that has the potentially subjective clause in it. So you would delete balconies facing existing all the way through, prevent use to residential use. That's what I would recommend. And then if you wanted to still approach and look into that Palo Alto ordinance, I found the I don't have it open in front of me, but little number 1, I found that really confusing, trying to draw these different view angles, and one of them was at 45 degrees and one of them was parallel to the floor of the balcony. I thought that was really confusing. I even tried to draw it, and I went to architecture school and I couldn't figure out how to draw it in section. However, little number 3 in that lists a very specific set of materials that you could demand be put on the railing of a balcony, which, because of the nature of the material, whether it's opaque glass or perforated metal, it would obstruct or certainly diffuse views from the balcony outward. So, I mean, that might be a potential solution you could consider, and I just wanted to throw that in there.
So let me just ask a clarifying question before I go back to Commissioner Janoff. So it sounds like you're recommending that it could be more objective simply by, it's kind of 2 stages of your recommendation. One was to delete the sentence that was too subjective and keep the standard. And then there's also the possibility of adopting part of Palo Alto's that was objective enough.
Correct. That's what,
Okay.
Part of what Commissioner Barnett recommended 3 weeks ago, and again for this meeting tonight.
Okay, got it. So I'm going to go back to Commissioner Janoff.
Well, I like the compromise that Mr. Ford is recommending, because I do think we want something in here. And if, I didn't take pen to paper, but if an architect says they can't figure it out, then I suspect that that's problematic. Although if it's in Palo Alto's objective standards, then you would think that if it wasn't workable, that they would have had feedback and made a change. So if the town attorney recommends that the suggestion that Mr. Ford recommends is sufficiently objective, then I would say, fine, let's leave it in. If we still need some numbers to support it, then the 30 feet is another number that's pretty easily measured, at least from a diagram of the proposed project. So looking forward to hearing from the town attorney.
If possible, what I would like to do is I'm going to go to B4.11 in the draft. And so if the commission likes, they could go on to the next topic while I look at how that standard would read without the last sentence.
I think the sentence recommended for deletion is the middle sentence. I think we still want balconies shall be without projections beyond the building footprint. I think that's
okay. That is sufficiently objective then.
Yeah, it's just, I think it's a
Yes.
middle sentence.
Okay. Yes, that works.
And if I could jump in a moment, I believe the reference to balconies shall be without projections beyond the building footprint is meant to only apply to balconies facing existing residential uses on abutting parcels. And so it may be, if you want to keep that meaning and have it not apply to the street facing balconies, then we would actually keep the first half of the second sentence and then keep the last sentence.
Okay, so it sounds like we have a proposal on the table, and so the fundamental question, we have some commissioners on the side of wanting to delete this entirely because we could never reach the level of objectiveness, but I'm hearing that we have kind of a proposal that would take it to a better place, and so there's many other commissioners that also want to keep this and try and improve it. Commissioner Janoff.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on a portion of what Commissioner Tavares commented. If we take this standard out, there won't be a case by case to be able to be evaluated. This is going to be outside the realm of the town being able to make a decision, right? So this whole thing is intended for developers to just be able to, boom, this is what we've got. So if we take balconies out, we don't have any say on balconies going forward. If the developer meets the criteria that puts them into this set of objective standards. So I think we personally would recommend keeping this in, so we have some objective standard to be able to have designers plan for. But I just wanted to make that comment. So if we think that it's any topic, whether it's balconies or windows or anything, if we think that it can be decided on a case-by-case basis when a developer is coming through this process, I think that's not what's going to happen. And staff could correct me if I'm wrong, but I just wanted to make that point.
Yes, and thank you for that. So I'm going to weigh in and say that I feel like we should try and keep it. What I'm hearing is our consultant has some ideas about how to make this more objective. Our town attorney agrees that we can make it more objective with a few ideas. And so it may not be perfect, but I also agree with Commissioner Janoff that if we take it off the table completely, then we won't have it. And so I think we should at least try and move forward and see if we can be successful with this, especially since we know how important these are to so many of our residents with new construction. Commissioner Thomas.
I completely agree. And I think that removing the part that is subjective is good. And I do think that, people care about this in balconies. So I'm happy with keeping it in. I do, however, want to make sure that if we take out the middle sentence, we're still clarifying that balconies can't project the balconies can't project beyond building footprints, only the ones that are facing the existing residential uses, right? On abutting parcels. We don't want it to say that we can't have any projections beyond the building footprint.
So if we take out, I'll jump in. So if we take out the middle sentence, it'll say balconies are allowed on facades facing the street and those facades facing existing non-residential uses on abutting parcels. Such balconies shall be without any projections beyond the building footprint.
So we want to change that such balconies. We want to specify it's the abutting the second word. Okay. That's what I just wanted to clarify and make sure that would be changed.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. So then it would say facades facing existing non-residential uses on abutting parcels. Balconies on facades facing existing non-residential shall be without any projections beyond the building footprint.
Yeah, so the words that we're actually taking out are allowed when blah, 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 such balconies. So it's just going to read abutting parcels shall be without. Okay, cool. Then I'm happy with that.
Vice Chair Barnett.
Yes, I very much like Mr. Ford's suggestion that we look into the materials that might be opaque or somehow screened but not closed as part of the solution. And I think the next critical issue would be the height of the balcony railing together with that.
Okay, Commissioner Thomas.
I just am wondering if staff or maybe Mr. Ford knows, are there standards for how high or low the balcony railing has to be? I'm assuming that there's like a safety. Okay, thank you.
Correct. Building code does have requirements for how tall a balcony railing needs to be.
And does
I don't know the number
on too for being able to get out or no?
Thank you, Commissioner Thomas. So I think what Ms. Armour was mentioning was there is a minimum. Depending on what floor it's on, it could be a fire issue if that is an egress or if they have to get a ladder to it. So I don't know that we have that specificity now, but there's definitely a minimum, and we can look into whether or not there's a maximum. If this is something the commission is interested in moving forward as part of their recommendation, we'll get together with the building official and look into that prior to going to town council.
Okay, so just as a quick checkpoint, it sounds to me like that other than, I'm not sure where Commissioner Tavana is at the moment, because he said basically take it out. Are there others that would object to keeping this in if we can improve it and make it more objective? So, okay, so I think we should start with that, and then we have the suggestion from Mr. Ford, and Vice Chair Barnett concur with that, and there's a couple of things that we can do, and the town attorney had weighed in as well. So it sounds to me like we should kind of take the range of suggestions that have been submitted and see what we can is going to be the most objective that we can stay with in this document. I don't know if that makes sense what I said, but I think, you know, I as far as moving forward, I think we have a number of suggestions that we can use to make it more objective. So I would say, staff, do you need specific direction on what to look into from here, or can you take the collective input that we have so far?
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Safdie, would you like to take
We'll
it
see if we were
first?
about to say the same thing. I was going to say, I do think we have enough information to move forward. We can work with the town's consultant and come up with some sort of additional screening requirement on those balconies.
Okay. All right. I think that sounds like a good resolution. And I think that the majority of the commission, you know, feels that this is worth pursuing. But I think most everyone agrees it needs to be more objective. So I think that's a good way to move forward. And so then I will go on to the item 4, which is pictures. And Ms. Quintana did refer to the pictures. And also we had the Housing Element Board member, Mayor, submitted a comment as well on this subject. The current draft objective standards contain design illustrations to demonstrate the intent of the draft standards. The general consensus at our last meeting on August 24th was to include pictures of existing development within the document for real world examples for some of the complicated design techniques to make it more user-friendly. And staff is looking forward for additional discussion and recommendation from the Planning Commission. And we did hear from Ms. Quintana tonight, a suggestion to do something similar to what staff did in our first staff report, which is to give examples of buildings, whether or not they would meet our standards or not. So I'd like to see what commissioners think about the picture issue and where to go with it. Commissioner Thomas.
I thank you, Chair Hansen. I would like to say that I know that we said that this document is for the public, and the public is going to be looking at it. So everyone needs to be able to understand it. But I think that ultimately the people that are going to be using this document the most are going to be architects. And so I was glad that we got the public comment from Mr. Mayor, because I do think that the line drawings are more helpful and offer more of a blank slate with regards to creativity and aren't as prescriptive. But I am curious to see if staff thinks that they are able to find examples where all standard, enough of the standards are met. My other compromise, I feel like, would be when we have examples, maybe there could be like examples at the end as part of, I don't know, at the end, just saying like, here is an existing building, here are the points that they met, and actually have a visual picture. And that might be like of a real building and include actual photos there. Instead of throughout the entire document, and have it be labeled a little bit in that way. I'm curious to see what other people think about that.
Thank you for that, Commissioner Thomas. And Commissioner Janoff has her hand up.
Yes, thank you. I was an advocate of including illustrations, not necessarily throughout, but just in general. But having heard from the architects, the the group of architects doesn't say much except what they did in the initial set of comments last meeting, where they didn't like the line drawings. But you know, given the remarks from Mr. Mayor, I think it's a good point. And I do agree with Commissioner Thomas. This really is a document that's for the design team and the architects more than it is a homeowner. It's not the residential design guidelines, for instance. Having said that, a question for staff. So I'm in favor of keeping the line drawings as is, and maybe not including illustrations throughout. But you in our last draft, you have a section. Is it a section B that includes the evaluation of existing developments? The question is that intended to be included as part of the design standards for illustration, or is that just for the Planning Commission?
Thank you for the question. That was initially intended just for the Planning Commission. There were commissioners that had specific questions on if these could actually be implemented in the real world. So those were examples on how they could. That being said, you know, we're happy to do whatever the Planning Commission recommends.
Yeah, excuse me, I asked because it was a nice, you know, small compilation of some reasonably well-designed buildings in town. And so I think it's a reasonable thing to include. It sort of satisfies both itches, right? It gives you some illustrations of how structures are meeting the requirements, but it doesn't muddy up the document section A. So I would be in favor of including B for illustrative purposes, and keeping line drawings in the balance of the section.
Thank you for that. Go ahead. Oh, did I miss? Okay. My thinking on this after you know, reading all the comments and hearing the additional feedback, although I think that the target market for this is the architects that are going to be designing these buildings, I also think that our public is a very close watchdog on a lot of these projects. And since they're going to be some of the bigger ones, I think just for the benefit of public transparency, it wouldn't be a bad idea to include some generalized pictures as discussed versus one on every standard for the benefit of the people in the public that might happen to go look at this document. And it's like, what is the town doing to make sure that we're taken care of? And it would probably be more illustrative to them to have photos, and I would just keep it fairly general as we were discussing. So that's what my thoughts are on it, but I'd like to hear what others think as well. Commissioner Raspy.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'm of the view, largely, I think in accord with Commissioner Janoff in that it's my, and the architects who've opined, it's my sense that the line drawings should be the primary reference tool in the document. But I see that there is some added benefit in having the pictures, as you indicate, shared to the public and maybe for some clarifying. So and the notion of having the line drawings as the predominant feature throughout the document, and perhaps an appendix or closing section, which has some prominent approved features that the town has signed off on in the past, and then perhaps some language somewhere in the document, because we wouldn't want to muddy waters, that essentially says the line drawings are the rule, and that the photos are there for illustrative purpose only. It wouldn't overrule or somehow overwrite our other written rules. Something along those lines, I think, maybe satisfies both camps.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Are there other comments? Vice Chair Barnett.
Yes, I support Commissioner Raspy's idea, but I wanted to bounce off the town attorney whether she thinks that inserting photos in the objective standards would create a problem because the photos are not in and of themselves objective.
No, I don't think that would pose a problem because the photos are intended to depict what's described in the wording. So I think that would be fine.
Okay. So I think I like the comments by Commissioner Janoff and Commissioner Raspy, and I think we should proceed in that way. And only use photos as a generalized thing and be very clear that the line drawings are the objective standard. Any other thoughts or comments or any objections to going that direction? Commissioner Thomas.
I would just like some clarification from Commissioner Janoff and Raspy about like, but I know that Commissioner Raspy, you said this, you feel like this is an appendix at the end, because that's how I feel it should be, like given as different examples. Like if you need further details on what this looks like in real life, go to this appendix at the end. Is that what you're thinking, Commissioner Janoff? Okay, thank you.
Yes, essentially we've got that section which reads as an appendix now as illustrations of how the standards have been met. And I think the clarifying language that Commissioner Raspy is suggesting is a good idea to include, just to note that these are examples and they may or may not meet other criteria. So we don't confuse anyone in saying these must be followed this way. But I agree that this could serve as the type of appendix that Commissioner Raspy is recommending.
Okay, so then if that answered your question, Commissioner Thomas, are you good with the proposal? Okay, all right. So I think we're good to move off of this, and that was the generalized questions that were in the staff report. So I was going to go to the addendum because the staff did comment on board housing element board member mayor's comments as well as the architect comments. So I'm pulling up the addendum right now, and there were 10 items that the staff wanted the planning commission to discuss further. And I just want to ask a clarifying question from staff that you responded to, and I know you worked very hard in the response. You responded to everything, and a lot of the things that were in the architect's document were in fact questions that needed clarification as opposed to recommended changes. So I'm assuming that that we could go by as long as we answer the questions that you had, like comment 9, 10, 11, 12, so on and so forth. Those are the things you wanted us to have further discussion. And then we could ask the commission if they felt like the rest of your answers or suggestions about whether to do or not do were good, and maybe do that as a group, or do you want us to discuss all of them?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, that's exactly how we intended this to be. If we could go through, give recommendations on the individual comments in the addendum report, and then if there was something in the items that weren't covered in the addendum where staff felt pretty confident about that any of the planning commissioners disagree with, please let us know. Okay,
that sounds good. Okay, so I'm going to go by the comment 9, and just to refresh everyone's memory, it relates to the continuous streetscape requirement in A.1111.1, which requires development in a community growth district to place at least 75% of the ground floor within 5 feet of street-facing property lines. And the comment was about whether or not it applies to the only the building or the entire length of the property line. And the draft standard is currently worded to apply only to the proposed buildings. And I'm assuming that the discussion that staff wants us to have is that what we intended?
Exactly.
Or if additional clarification is needed.
Yeah. Okay. Or yes. Okay. Since people were asking the question, Commissioner Thomas.
I'm sorry, can you repeat which section of the draft it is so I can go scroll up to it?
A.11.1.
Okay, thank you.
So I know Commissioner Janoff and I, we're on the general plan committee, and you were as well, Commissioner Thomas. I think this got started during the discussion of the community, the growth districts that we have, and wanting to not have the parking lot in front and the building behind, which is kind of the old version of how we, do these kinds of developments, and we wanted to basically, bring the street forward to the buildings in place and stuff. So I guess the question would be whether there's a reason to do something else besides the building, or if there's something else to consider. Vice Chair Barnett.
My thought on this is that the last sentence, the draft standard, is currently worded to only apply to the proposed buildings. I think that's how it should be written. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Thomas.
I agree.
I don't know how you would do it any other way, because what they're asking to do is build a building. So I think that's probably the clearest, most objective thing that we can do. Any other thoughts? Okay, so I think as long as it's clear that it applies to the proposed building, we can leave it to you, staff, whether or not you think that we should make the language clearer in the standard, but that is clearly the intent. Okay, comment 10, questions why section A.11.2 has a maximum percentage for site amenities in front of the front facade. The maximum percentage was originally included to ensure visibility to the ground floor uses. However, in the case of restaurant uses, it might be overly restrictive. And so the standard could be modified to include a minimum, but no maximum. So it sounds like that might be the proposal, which is to take away the maximum. Commissioner Gatos.
Agreed. I thought that was an excellent point.
Made sense to me as well. Other comments on comment 10? Okay, I'm going to assume that since there's no other comments that we all agree. And so comment 12 questions how the arcade in B.1.1.D and the recessed building entry B.1.1.C standards could be incorporated into the same building. The Planning Commission could consider removing the full height of the facade requirement from B.1.1.C or removing the arcade option from B.1.1.D in its entirety to remedy this concern. Any thoughts? Vice Chair Barnett.
Yeah, I'm interested in whether the staff had a position on this, but to me, it seems like the full length of the facade is a standard that we don't want to use.
Staff, do you have a comment on?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. That was staff's initial recommendation, that it does seem like that would be the cleanest resolution, and that way we're still holding on to the arcade standard.
Okay, so that sounds like the easiest way to go, and Vice Chair Barnett has made that recommendation. Other commissioners have any other thoughts on that? So the proposal is to remove the language full height of the facade from B.1.1.C to solve the problem. Okay, sounds like we're good to go. Comment 13, also related to the arcade option in B.1.1.D, stating that longer buildings would look monotonous with a continuous arcade. The arcade option could either be removed or a limit to the required arcade length could be added. That's on comment 13. Commissioner Tavana.
Thank you, Chair. In general, I think a limit would make the most sense to me. I don't know what that limit would be necessarily, but I don't think we should remove it altogether.
I think that's, thank you for that. And I'm pretty darn sure with that, when we were on the subcommittee, we spent lots and lots and lots of time on how to make sure that we didn't have big blank walls of buildings that were, without architectural detail. So that is why there are so many of these things in the document right now. Commissioner Respi.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with Commissioner Tabana. I think we should retain the arcade design feature. And I think I don't have a specific figure in mind either. It seems to me that the notion should be that the arcade should predominate the front. It should be the predominant design feature. And so I'll just throw out as a point for discussion, perhaps it should cover 75% of the frontage, or some percentage greater than 50%. So it becomes the predominant design feature of the building.
Okay, no, thank you for that input. We have a comment from Mr. Safdie.
Thank you. Sorry for interjecting. I just wanted to point out that the architects did provide specific numbers for that. If the commission's struggling to come up with exactly how to define that, there was a recommendation made by the architect.
Could you tell it to us, just because there's so many documents in play?
Of course. So the suggestion was, when over 80 or 100 feet long, a 2/3 arcade approach could apply. So if we want to go with clean numbers, over 100 feet, then 2/3 of that facade needs to have arcades.
And then if it's less than 80 to 100 feet, what would it be then?
If it was less than, then it would be a continuous arcade.
It would be continuous across the entire, versus not the whole thing, but 2/3. Okay, Commissioner Janoff.
I was going to point to the same recommendation from the architects, but I'm wondering, Mr. Safdie, why we would go with the upper number of 100 when an 80-foot long building might read pretty long, and the architects put that range in there. I'm just thinking over 80 might be better than over 100, but I would defer to staff of the architect. I mean, this is really a design aesthetic, so I would choose one number, but whatever you think is the better design number.
So thank you. I actually would defer to Mr. Ford, our consultant, since he is more familiar with these. I just happen to choose the cleaner number as an example.
Yeah. Okay, and Mr. Ford has his camera on, so please go ahead.
And my microphone. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I would think, and I'm also thinking of, specifically the Los Gatos context, and maybe the typical frontage length that you'll be seeing. So I would go with the smaller number of 80, or maybe even less, and put that for the sort of the parameter where you make a jump. So if a frontage is longer than 80 feet, then 2/3 of that frontage needs to have an arcade in order to qualify for this point system. And if it's less than 80 feet, you might consider something less than 100, but more than 2/3, because I think if you look at the architect's full submittal, they discuss the arcade quite a bit, and how imposing it upon the whole frontage could tend to be kind of cumbersome. So I think we could come up with, one standard for less than 80 feet and a different percentage for over 80 feet.
And neither of which would be 100.
That's what I'm suggesting, but you may disagree with me.
Okay, no, I just want to make sure I was understanding your suggestion. So, okay, Commissioner Tabana.
Thank you. In general, I do think that any continuous arcade would be monotonous inherently. Maybe we can adopt a 2/3 approach across the board. Because if it's 50 feet, 60 feet, whatever, I still think it would be monotonous. So I think 2/3 in general, no matter how long it may be, would be a good approach to consider.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Other thoughts on this? Commissioner Janoff.
Do we have any arcade buildings or buildings with arcades? And I can't think of one. Staff, do we have any examples that you could? I mean, I'm thinking to Commissioner Tabana's point that that's an interesting concept, but if it's a very small building, if it's only, 40 or 50 feet wide, then having an arcade not across the entirety of it might look odd. I mean, I think this is really something that, I personally would defer to the architects on the team and go with that. Yeah, but if there's an example in town that shows a truncated arcade across the front of the building, that I'd like to know if we have one.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Mr. Ford and then to Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you. And following on what Commissioner Janoff is talking about, it could be that you don't actually see this tried to be implemented that often, because if you think of an infill situation, putting an arcade on front of a building, it's really going to be impacted by what's on either side. So, because it's basically an interior sidewalk. So what's the point of having an interior sidewalk if you run into the wall of the adjacent building? So arcades tend to happen in a situation where it's more of a comprehensive development, or a comprehensive, the way the town developed, let's say Old Sacramento, New Orleans, things like that. So I don't think you're going to be seeing it that often, but I think by keeping the amount of the facade that's covered by the arcade, it'll help with the infill situation if it is implemented.
Okay, thank you for that. Commissioner Thomas.
The two examples that I can think of are like the King's Cross Shopping Center. Is that what it is? Like with Lenardi's, and isn't there an arcade across, like in front of the bank and all of that, and part of that area? I mean, it's like not architecturally beautiful, but that's an arcade, and then like the post office downtown. But I do agree that I think that it would be helpful to put a maximum in, just because these are objective standards, but I also agree that we're not the experts to decide that. So I'm very happy to defer to staff to talk to our consultants and go with whatever maximum visually makes sense. Especially because we're not going to be using that. This is probably not going to be utilized very often, like Mr. Ford just said.
Yep. And Mr. Ford, you still have your hand up. So did you have additional comments?
Sorry, excuse me.
Okay. No. Okay. So I'm going to say that that it sounds reasonable to have a standard as recommended by the consultants to have less of the facade if it's over a certain distance, and then more of the facade in terms of percentage if it's less than certain distance. And I completely agree with the other commissioners that we're not in a position as planning commissioners to really be able to judge that the best way. So I would like to maybe give that as direction to staff, that let's go down the path of having different standards for different lengths, but keep it simple, and have the number assigned to it, and take the input of the architect community to come up with the right number. Does that sound reasonable? Okay. All right. So let's do that. Oh, shoot. Okay. And then comment for, oh, I'm sorry, we had more questions. Commissioner Thomas, you still have your hands up on this one? Okay. And Vice Chair Barnett.
My understanding is that we're trying to finalize the objective standards tonight. So my idea would be to refer this issue to the council with any input that might be provided by staff after the meeting.
Right. I think that's what maybe my suggestion was not clear enough, is that we would go ahead with that approach, and that the number would be filled in at somewhere in the near future by staff with input from people that have more expertise. So I think we're going to go ahead and keep it with that. And then we can go on to comment 14, which is requesting an additional section be added to deal with corner lots. And although this does not currently exist, this could be developed in the future. And staff was saying in a nice way. I think that what they're saying is it would be a lot of trouble to add that in. And since we're so far behind schedule, that might be a nice add on at a later point, but it could hold up the document. Am I characterizing that correctly, staff?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So, commissioners, are there thoughts about whether or not it's important to have it in this version of the document? Commissioner Respi.
Thanks, Chair. I agree with staff. At some point, I would like to see this incorporated into the document. But given where we are in the process, I think, and let's proceed without it for now. And as an additional note, I think corner lot developments are probably going to be the minority of developments we see. It'll be largely more infill type projects. And so it probably is going to be the least impactful section. Let's proceed without it for now, but with a notation that we'd like to see it developed on the next round if possible.
Very good. Thank you for that. Commissioner Janoff.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there is a specific bullet point from the architects that say we should have a section on corners, but it struck me that it was a follow-on to the previous bullet where they were sort of, going on about, well, what happens if this and if that and if the other, and then, oh gosh, now that we're talking about corners, let's go there. So I didn't get the sense that that was the same, I don't know, the same level of importance. And so I would agree. Let's stay the course on what we have. And if it looks like we need more specificity on corners, if things are going crazy on all of these great developments that are going to come our way, then, take another look at making something more specific then.
Very good. Thank you for that. Okay, so I think we're going to go with that recommendation to that we should try to add that in a future version of the document, but not hold up the progress of this document. Okay, and then the next one is comment 18 and 19 that are related to the belly band option in B.4.1.d. Based on the reasoning provided, Planning Commission can consider removing this option. And staff, can you remind us of the, because like I said, there's multiple documents out there, and maybe not everyone has them all up at the same time. I know I don't. They wanted us to remove the belly band option entirely, or they wanted to reduce. I thought I saw something there about reducing the size of it. Can you maybe give us some clarification about what specifically the architects were looking for?
Certainly. Let's see. So the first one was comment 18. Basically, belly bands don't always work, especially not a continuous belly band, especially if you have pop outs, recesses, pilasters, and whatnot. The second comment 19 was specifically about the width of the belly band or the height of the belly band, pointing out that we require 10 and Palo Alto requires 4.
Okay, so thoughts about that from the commission. Commissioner Channel.
I would remove it.
The B.4.1.d. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Commissioner Respi.
Yeah, I agree. I don't find the belly band a particularly effective device for breaking up a facade, and furthermore, going to a smaller belly band seems to me to even exacerbate the problem. So I would agree. I would eliminate.
Okay. Any other thoughts? In a different direction. Otherwise, we're going to recommend to remove it. Okay, sounds like we agree. So then we can move on to comment 23, which questions how B.4.3 would be applied. For example, if a single bay window would be sufficient to qualify for the points listed. Staff can either add greater specificity for certain items or remove this requirement. And they are looking for direction from the Planning Commission. Commissioner Janoff and then Vice Chair Barnett.
Yeah, this was an interesting comment. I mean, I can't imagine an architect coming forward with a mishmash of balconies and no balconies. I mean, that just seemed to me to be taking the point a little bit too far. But if staff has a way to insert language that talks about the, I think can't remember the exact term, but it was sort of the integrity of design or something, which is completely not objective, so that won't work. But if there's some language that could be inserted that would clarify that what they're talking about in terms of a whole bunch of different elements just to rack up points. I mean, I'm not sure how that could be done, but what they propose could happen, sort of like gaming the point system. Yeah, I guess it could happen, but how do we make sure it doesn't?
Staff, do you, actually, Mr. Ford is here. So could you comment on that? Because you helped us develop this thing. And so I think you have experience with other jurisdictions. What are your thoughts on this particular issue?
Yes, thank you, Chair. If the commission prefers to keep this 4.3, B.4.3, I think it's possible to go in and add greater specificity. I read the architect's comments and I thought, oh, that's interesting. You know, somebody put one Juliet balcony, so therefore they get the points. So I think, I don't know if anybody has, it's packet page 225, you see page 4.3, excuse me, B.4.3. Each of those lines would probably get longer because we would add some specificity. And I wouldn't say, you know, Juliet's on 100% of the windows. Let the designer have a little bit of flexibility and maybe pull out a massing piece. So you might say Juliet's applied to 40% of the fenestration or 60% or something. And you might say one chimney's enough. And you might say, you know, a certain number of balconies. So I think we can provide greater specificity if you want to keep B.4.3.
I think we already discussed that we wanted to keep B.4.3, but okay, let me see. We have several commissioners with their hands up. Vice Chair Barnett, and then Commissioner Tabana, and then Commissioner Clark.
Thank you, Chair. I share exactly Mr. Ford's thinking. I think that the architects may have overstated the possibility and made it a ridiculous hypothesis, but nevertheless, there's a lot of room for clarification that I think should be made before this is sent to the council or in the process of submitting it to the council that we have further specification. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Commissioner Tabana.
Thank you. I agree with Commissioner Barnett. You know, in the sense that adding specificity could help, but in the examples given, there were a single bay window. But in the, you know, the objective standards, I don't know if this matters or not, but it clearly states bay windows, not just one. So it is plural. A lot of these are plural, and that could alleviate some of the, you know, the issues. So, but adding specificity definitely will help.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Clark.
Thank you. Sorry, I haven't been participating more. I'm very under the weather, but I've been appreciating all of the comments, and I promise I would say something if I disagreed with any decisions that were being made. So for this one, I definitely agree that I would want to see it kept in, and I think having the maximum of 16 or the minimum of 16 points needed would hopefully keep people from going too crazy, like gaming it and trying to add as many features as possible and stuff. But I do think that it would be a problem if someone decided to get all of their points using like the 3-point ones or something, because it would become pretty clunky. So I agree first that we need more specificity. And then I was thinking, I don't know if there's a way to say, you know, like get this many, at least this many points from these ones or something, like making sure that they use at least one of the 8-point ones or something. But I was thinking we might want to do something like that just to make sure that nobody just uses all of the 3-pointers and gets some really clunky looking design.
Great. No, I think that's a good suggestion. So staff, I think that what I'm hearing is that more specificity would be good, that we like the system, and just to you maybe try and put a little bit more specificity and to help avoid gaming the system. And I think Commissioner Clark had an idea about maybe you have to use some of this and some of this versus a bunch of the lower point things or something like that. Is that enough for you guys to go on?
I believe so. I'll defer to Mr. Ford since you're going to be the one helping us with this.
Yeah.
Yes, that's great. Great input.
Okay, great. Let's see. Comment 24 suggests that the illustration of pilasters should be removed. The illustration was a specific request from a previous hearing, but it could be removed. So we added, Commissioner Janoff, I'll go to you. So.
I think there's two different figures that include pilasters or pilasters. And I think the illustration that is being objected to is 4.5, which is on page 26 of 29. And I agree that pilasters in this particular example would be highly unlikely. So, I mean, it seems to be a highly unlikely design element to have in there. And it doesn't particularly illustrate the change in materials concept that this item is speaking to. So I think in this case, I would be in favor of removing the pilasters in this particular illustration, but in illustration, page 16 of 29, whichever section that is, there's an illustration that includes them on that line drawing, and those should be kept. So just to clarify which drawing we're talking about.
Thank you for that, for bringing that up. So there's two illustrations and you're saying keep the one and not the other.
Right.
Yep. And that sounds like a very good recommendation. Other comments from commissioners? Okay, since no one else is out, Mr. Ford.
So thank you. So I think also, just so you're not surprised later, I think by taking out the pilasters from figure B 0.4.5, I think we will also help you by making an edit to the text of standard 4.5. Changes in building materials shall occur at inside corners that break up the facade plane, such as columns. Oh, no, so at inside corners, well, I think what we'll do is we'll delete the reference in the text standard about architectural features. I think that's what led us astray on this issue.
Okay, so it sounds like this problem is solved. Okay, all right. Comment, the last one that we were asked for input on was comment 27, suggesting that rather than prohibiting rooftop and upper floor terraces and decks, that they could be allowed given certain controls. Commissioner Janoff.
I strongly agree with this recommendation. It seems that we might want to be using rooftop of these buildings for gathering spaces. It's done all over, including having green rooftops or green gardens or green space, or that could be the common space. It could be used really creatively and beautifully. So I would recommend looking at this one to make it to change it and include that as a potential feature, perhaps.
That sounds great. Commissioner Thomas.
I agree with Commissioner Janoff's comments, and I also thought that rooftops, this is a good opportunity to create additional green space, especially since green space can sometimes be lost when we go to higher density housing. And I know that's something that we don't want to do for the town. I also think that I think that the intent of this is to ensure privacy. And I think there are ways that we can still make sure that there is privacy on rooftops, even if they are accessible to people and used as part of the built space. And I think that it is a good opportunity. So I'm supportive of it too.
Great. Vice Chair Barnett.
Yes, I've seen rooftop spaces be used as for social gatherings in barbecues and whatnot. And I think it's an excellent amenity for people in high-rise developments who don't have a lot of space to meet. They can have parties out there and whatnot. And I've also seen it used as a private deck space for the owners who are adjacent. This is a little unusual, but there was a parapet wall and there were units that faced the roof, and they were able to divide it into exclusive use areas. So I think, in short, the idea of setbacks for privacy makes sense, but also the utility of using the space is important to retain in the objective standards.
Great. I think that's a good suggestion. Any other comments on this? It sounds like we should definitely keep this, and there are some suggestions on how to make it clearer and have more control. Anything else you need from us on this particular one, staff? Ms. Armour?
Thank you, Chair. I would suggest if the Planning Commission has any direction on particular things, for example, setback from the edge of the building, that you would support as those additional privacy controls, that discussion would be helpful in guiding staff in drafting something to take to Town Council.
Got it. Okay. Looks like we have a couple hands up. Commissioner Janoff.
Thank you. Yes, the architects did recommend a setback, and they also talk about a daylight plane. I don't know what the daylight plane might, I haven't heard that term, so I don't know what that is, but presumably it's some sort of a sight line. But they do offer the concept of setback, and I think there should be a setback. Unless somehow it's a completely green space right at the edge, you could plant the setback. But I would make sure that the gathering space for individuals would be inside a setback.
Okay, sounds good. Commissioner Thomas.
I agree. I think that I feel like hopefully we can find a standard setback that exists somewhere else that we know is appropriate. I also am happy to say, and I don't know if this is, I think this is still objective, but like it either needs to be a setback or there needs to be some sort of screening, like one setback for if you can see out and another setback if you can't see out, because I feel like the setback is only necessary for the privacy or for safety purposes. But if there is some sort of screening, I don't know what is considered a rooftop, if there's a specific wall, but I'm assuming it's the top of the building that's open to the sky. So I'm curious to know what commissioners think about that.
Are there other comments? And Commissioner Respi?
Thank you, Chair. I also thought about screening. And my concern with that is depending on the design and style, unless the screening is also set back, it can add to the massing of the building. Essentially, if it's going to be a 6-foot barrier, for instance, we're adding 6 foot of height to our building. So unless it's set back significantly from the existing frontage of the building or it's somehow distinguished in material, my concern would be that adding a lot of shielding would overly complicate things. That being said, I fully support a rooftop situation, and I think setback is probably the preferred method of doing it, with maybe a secondary lower shielding if that's the only solution possible.
Okay, I think that's a good suggestion as well. Staff, what more can we do to help on this?
Thank you, Chair. I think based on the direction that we've heard from the Commission this evening, we will develop a recommendation for a setback from the edge of the roof for buildings that abut single-family zoning districts on the side of the building that abuts them, and provide that as a recommendation on your behalf to Town Council.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay, all right, good. Vice Chair Barnett, sorry.
Yes, thank you. In item 27, in the architects, when the staff responds to the architects, it says, they say, wouldn't it be more appropriate to have a setback to rooftop decks and balconies? And I wasn't sure what rooftop balconies would be. Maybe that could be clarified or removed.
Is that in the document now? No, that's in the comments from the architects, right? Okay. You're on mute.
You're correct. It's in the comments from the architects.
Through the
Okay.
chair, it referenced the, when we're looking at 4.10, it references rooftop and upper floor terraces and decks. So not balconies.
Okay, so then we don't, then we have the information we need in terms of controls, because we don't have a conflict, basically, because a rooftop balcony would be kind of strange. So, okay, are we good on comment 27? Okay, so I'm just continuing to go through the addendum, which was very helpful, by the way, staff, that you went through all the comments and kind of gave us some feedback on that, and it helps make our discussion more efficient. So you also brought out your comments on the submission from Mr. Mayor from the Housing Element Board, who's also an architect. And I don't think we need to discuss the first one, which was he brought up about real world photo examples, and we already discussed that earlier. But he did have some other specific suggestions, one of which was that the parking structure entry gate setback be reduced to under 25 feet. And he did go into detail about, with a dense kind of building, trying to create a 25-foot setback would be an awfully big ask for them to be able to do that. So are there, and as staff, you're wanting us to comment about whether we should include that or not. And I mean, you didn't recommend one way or the other.
So I'll start, and then Mr. Safdie may have something to add. With any of these where a change is being recommended, we called out if we had a significant concern, but would be looking to see if the commission supports making the change. In this case, we do want to have some setbacks so that we avoid queuing in the street. And often the gate for a parking garage is actually set back farther within the building facade. So it doesn't mean that the front wall of the building needs to be set back. Mr. Safdie, did you have anything else to add on that one?
Yeah, you basically said what I was about to. And then the one thing I would add, the only thing that we do have in town code right now, it does require 18 feet from any sort of vehicular gate to the edge of the street. So if the planning commission does want to reduce below 25, I would recommend ensuring that we still do have the 18 feet.
Okay, so that we don't just remove the requirement entirely. Commissioner Respy.
Thank you, Chair. I would argue against removing the section. I think it is important for pedestrian safety to avoid a situation where we have queuing. Seems to me that ideally, maybe what you want is whatever the length of 2 cars is. That's because essentially that's going to be a most common scenario, I think, where you would run into problems. So if that's 18 feet, that's 18 feet. If it's 20 feet, I don't know what that number is, but it seems to me whatever the length of 2 average cars would probably be adequate for our purposes.
Great. No, thank you for that. Commissioner Janoff and Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you. I read in Mr. Mayor's comments that he's looking for something. Well, okay, so I agree we shouldn't remove this section, but amended to be much less than 25 feet. I would go back to the architects and ask what much less looks like. It may be that the 18 feet is also untenable. I don't know. So I would say keep it, but see if you can get some input from the architects specifically regarding these kind of structures.
You mean in addition to Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, I mean, well, go back to Mr. Mayor. He's making the comment, he's asking for a significant reduction, and he seems to be speaking from experience. We could guess at this number, we could go with the 18 feet, but that might still not be workable. So my suggestion is to go back to the architects and see if we can find something. I mean, keeping in mind that what we're trying to do is keep these things objective, but also we want these buildings to be built. So, if we put too many constraints, then that makes just breaking ground not workable, then we've sort of killed something from the outset. So I'd look to get some input from the experts on this one.
Okay, that sounds reasonable. And I'm what I'm hearing loud and clear though is that we don't want to remove this. But let's see what Commissioner Thomas has to say.
I agree that we do not want to remove this for the safety concerns. And I do, but however, I do want to ensure that we are highly, highly, highly encouraging below ground parking, because we know that that is a huge priority for us to achieve some of our like higher density projects that we want. And I know that it also makes it more expensive for developers, but I think that we need to make sure that we're not putting a number on here that is not possible. When we say 25, a minimum of 25 feet between the gate and the back of the sidewalk, we are saying like the length. It doesn't have to it's not like a bird's eye view, right? It's the length of the actual driveway has to be 25 feet. So that could curve or turn, correct, staff? Okay. I do know that there are gates that exist like this out here. Most parking garages, I feel like, that I'm familiar with below ground parking have the gate like below. I don't know. I guess that my question is like 25 feet doesn't seem that unreasonable to me, but obviously I'm not an architect. But if I'm thinking about like how far is the distance if we were to put a gate at the bottom of some of the part, like any below, I guess all of our below ground parking in town doesn't have a top. I don't know. I was trying to think of in downtown. Anyway, okay. I just think we need to make sure we want to encourage below ground parking. So we need to make sure that the number that is chosen is specific. So it's objective, but it also ensures that we can still get a lot of below ground parking.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is we want to keep this requirement in here, but we don't feel like we have enough expertise to specify. I did hear from staff that we have already a requirement for 18 feet. So can staff check with some of the architects to see, if this really is a big problem, and that would necessitate it being less than even 18 feet? Because I don't think any of us have any enough real world experience with this particular requirement. Is that enough direction?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think we can proceed with that. In order to give the Planning Commission a little more context, our current standard for parking, if you have a 2-car garage, you're going to be required to do 20 by 20 clear on the inside. So that's 20 foot deep for each of the 2 cars. If you're looking at the distance from the face of a garage, even if the required building setback is less, then we require the 18 feet. But in many cases, the front setback that governs the distance to a garage is actually 25 feet. So this isn't inconsistent with a lot of the other circumstances where you have enough space for a car to park in the front of a garage and not be overlapping with the sidewalk.
Right. Well, and also it was my understanding when we were going through this whole process, as the subcommittee before the document was drafted, that that our consultant has a substantial experience working with many jurisdictions on this stuff. So, we were relying pretty heavily on them to work with our staff to come up with the right numbers for this stuff. So I guess what I'm hearing is there's, it's probably worth checking with some people, but we don't want to, wholesale remove things that that were recommended. Mr. Ford. You're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, you're correct. We can look into this further.
Okay. All right, great. Okay, so let's go on. The next one was similar. It was about vehicular entry gates. And there's a 6-foot height limit for those. And he wanted those to be increased because he was talking about, parking situations and that it wasn't going to be high enough. Commissioner Janoff.
Thank you. He makes a good point, but I think we can correct the concept by inserting vehicular entry gates and pedestrian entry gates located in perimeter fencing shall have a maximum of 6 feet. I think that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about entrances that are in a building face, right? It's
right.
Something that's in the fencing or in some sort of perimeter barrier.
That sounds reasonable. Any other thoughts on?
I certainly wouldn't want to increase it to 8 feet across the board, because then you wind up with 8-foot fences at the perimeter, right? So I think that would solve the problem.
I like that suggestion. Any other thoughts on this one? Okay. All right. Let's see. We don't have too much more to go through. The public comment question, whether landscape roofs can count towards landscaping requirements in standard A.10.1.a, and whether 20% is too high. For 20% being that 20% of the total square footage has to be landscaped. And whether or not landscape roofs could count for that, because it might be too much. Commissioner Janoff and then Commissioner Thomas.
Yeah, I think that we definitely, based on our previous conversation, we should allow landscaped rooftops to be counted. But not everybody's going to do a landscape roof. So if that 20% still seems high, then there should be an if-then term included. So if it will be such and such a percent unless there's a rooftop and the rooftop can count toward that percent. But yeah, I think that number, and maybe it should be a range. We've been the following his following point has to do with how large balconies or common space or community recreation space are, and there's a recommendation that it would be a certain size for such a certain size building and a certain size for certain other size buildings. So I think maybe this is another one where there could be a range if the landscape space of 20% seems onerous, but definitely count rooftop.
Right. Yeah, I know his concern was that the landscaping requirement being that high could defer high density housing or deter high density housing. Commissioner Thomas.
I agree that we should definitely count landscape roofs toward the 20%. So I think that should be added. I also know that people value green space in town and are afraid of really high density housing. So I can see maybe why this is 20% was initially chosen as the number, but I'm happy to hear what other cities have decided to do, because I'm open to reducing that.
Well, so you brought up the thing that you're starting to go in a direction that I wanted to make sure we reminded ourselves of, that is that this document is intended for to comply with certain laws that have been handed down by the state of California, and that it's separate and aside from the discretionary approval process that we already have. And so, there's always the possibility where they bring in a project and they want to take advantage of the streamlined processing procedure, and they decide that it doesn't work for them. They can still go through the discretionary process that we have. This is just to take advantage of the streamlined process. And I know that when we heard the North 40 and the North 40 specific plan had a 20% or 30% open space requirement, and 20% had to be green, I think is the numbers. I might be wrong off by that, but that was a big deal for everyone. And they did find a way to meet it. And so I think it would be, we'd have to think long and hard about, taking that off the table, because we're basically taking away the discretionary approval process with this document. And, we want to make sure that it turns out the way that we're hoping for. Commissioner Janoff.
I just wanted to make a clarification that the 20%, the landscape rooftop could count toward the 20% as long as it's accessible by all residents. It can't be like a private rooftop garden for the penthouses, right? So
Yeah.
let's make sure that that's also included.
Yep. I mean, I honestly, maybe I didn't read his thing right, but I thought that the landscape roof thing was kind of like the lesser of the two issues. The 20% was the issue, and that it might be too high and prevent high density housing. But I think we've already heard from a couple commissioners that we know that our residents are really concerned about that. So I think it would be a hard ask to take it down below 20. Commissioner Thomas.
I guess I do have a clarification, because I do agree that this should be accessible to everyone, but is the current way it's written, is landscaped area considered, like all 20% of that has to be, accessible to all residents?
Question for staff.
Yeah.
Sorry, give me 1 second just to triple check.
And I can go ahead and jump in. So, I think that
we don't specify.
Commissioner
Sorry,
Janoff's-
Mr. Paulson.
Yeah, Commissioner Janoff's comments, I think, were specific to the rooftop deck, and that the residents of that community, not just the penthouses, for instance, had access to that. So it's an amenity for those folks. It's not an amenity for the entire public. So it's just for that specific site. And it's not specified in there. So that's something that we'll look at adding specificity.
Okay, so if because we have a landscape, because it just says right now, landscape space, a minimum of 20% of the site area shall be landscaped, but that doesn't have to be, that whole 20%, the way it's written right now, does not have to be accessible to everyone, because this is separate. This is like a completely separate thing from the 60% of the community space shall be open to the sky, etc. I'm just trying to interpret the rule correct.
Okay, so Mr. Safdie, you had your hand up. I'm going to ask you before I go back to the other commissioners.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to take a stab at answering that. So just a reminder, all of these three areas, the landscaped area, community open space, and recreation open space, they're all calculated separately. So previously there was mention about using, let's say, a rooftop deck towards the landscaping requirement and, let's say, a community open space requirement. As the document's written right now, you would not be able to use them both. Landscaping's really just intended to add greenery to the site. That's how it was drafted.
Okay, and Ms. Armour? You're on mute.
Thank you. I wanted to add the suggestion that under key terms at the beginning of the document, we have a definition of landscaping. And so considering if there are details that should be added to that definition of landscaping is probably where this would be. whether landscaping could potentially include a rooftop deck if accessible to all residents, or similar language.
That makes a lot of sense. And I was glad Commissioner Janoff brought that up because, you know, not that super high density housing would have penthouses, but you know, you wouldn't want it to be private because that kind of defeats the purpose of what we're trying to accomplish. So let's see, several commissioners have their hands up. Commissioner Janoff, and then Commissioner or Vice Chair Barnett and Commissioner Thomas.
Yeah, just a quick clarification. The 20% doesn't need to be contiguous land, right? I mean, they can count pockets and so on, right? So my comment about residential access to a rooftop would be like, let's make sure if that's the only 20% set aside, everybody has access to it. But if it's in fact in addition to a bunch of other little pockets, then you know that it counts as an aggregate, right? If that's clear.
Yeah, so I mean, the landscaped areas, they can be in multiple different locations. For example, shrubbery along a walkway. The point I just want to clarify one more time, the idea of a rooftop deck with landscaping, let's say a communal garden, that would count towards the, sorry, what's the term for it? Community recreation space, which then would not count towards landscaping unless we remove the term saying that they are calculated mutually exclusive from each other.
I just, through the chair, if we could
Go ahead.
just think about that a little bit more critically as you know go through in your mind how those might be in conflict, when we could create some really beautiful community space that is, you know, partially lit. I mean, just think about whether that is asking too much. And I'd say, depending upon the design, and of course that's subjective, it should count as the same. I mean, it shouldn't be counted separately.
Do other commissioners have thought that's it? Vice Chair Barnett.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Ms. Armour brought up the landscaping definition under key terms, and I'm happy with the 20%, but I am concerned about landscaping as it's described in the key terms because of the drought situation and the need to conserve water. And it seems to primarily, if not exclusively, require greenery. So I think that's something that we ought to look at as part of the whole picture.
Okay. Commissioner Thomas and then Commissioner Tabana.
I agree that we do need to be conscious about the water use. And I also think that we need some clarification or need to rethink the differences between the landscaped private recreation space and community recreation space. I do think that if something qualifies separately as landscaped and it also could serve as a community recreation space, for example, like a communal garden, I would be happy with that being able to be counted in both spaces. I think that like being able to double dip in that area is going to provide for more creativity from architecture standpoint and more creativity with the use of space. So I'm happy with that being able to be double dipped. And then I think also that allows for more flexibility with regards to like the 20% doesn't just have to be like green, we're looking at it. It can be usable space also, which I think is the most important part. And also like drought, you know, it can be just more usable space that we benefit more from than just like existing. So I do think that that is a change that we should definitely consider. And I also do believe that not all of the, like, I don't think that the way that we have it written right now, landscaped space all needs to be publicly accessible. But again, if it's counting as both community recreation space and landscaped space, then it should be, if that makes sense. My last thing is that if a rooftop is going to be used either for community recreation space, well, I guess not community, I guess for as landscape space, if we're counting a 20% minimum. I guess my question is that, like, it's 20%. Right now it says 20% of the site area. That should just be the site area. I mean, the rooftop basically should be like free bonus area. It shouldn't be considered in the total area. It's not additional area, if that makes sense. Like, it should just be, I don't know how we consider that though, then in the 20%, because we're not mandating that anyone put anything on the rooftop. Do you guys, I mean, are other people understanding how we could create a conflict? No. Okay. So it's like, okay, Commissioner Janoff, I know I'm like looking at you and your like faces. Okay. So if we are requiring a minimum 20% of the site that should be landscaped, and then we say you can use the rooftop for that, we need to decide if we are counting, then does the rooftop count to the total area that we are considering? Like, is it our denominator or not? And I think it should be not ever included in the denominator. It's just like an optional bonus area that you could use and utilize. Okay, now she understands. Great.
Okay. So Ms. Armour and Mr. Shafty as well? No, he took his hand up. Ms. Armour, and then Commissioner Janoff.
Thank you. Just to help with the clarification of what Commissioner Thomas was trying to describe, I think one question is when we talk about 20% of the site area, whether that is being understood as the open parts of the site versus the site area as a whole before it's been developed. So if you're saying 20% of the site area, then that is of the entire property before it is developed. And so that 20%, some of that could be on the roof.
Okay, Commissioner Janoff.
Yeah, my assumption is that the 20% is of the whole site before anything is built, right? And that, build your building as large or as small as you can, and you've got 20% remaining on the ground, or you've got, and then take that amount and apply that to the roof instead. So you can make a bigger building and use your rooftop. And yes, I think I understand, but yeah, but it is the whole site, and then the developer gets to decide whether they're going to keep ground level green space, community, or whatever, or rooftop, or a combination.
So I was going to go back to, I mean, there's a lot of people that aren't happy with the North 40, but I particularly did like the open space requirement in the North 40 specific plan. And so, my thoughts were that I wouldn't want all that stuff to be counted separately. I kind of like the North 40 specific plan because it had the idea that you had a number of different ways to get at open space. And then it was up to the creativity of those. And then there was a minimum for green open space so that you knew there would be, some of that, it wouldn't just all be hardscape pathways or things like that. Commissioner Tivana.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, my concern would be just seeing hardscaped as a person walking by the property being developed. If we were to count to 20%, say for the landscape roof. So I would like to see it as written, 20% of the area shall be landscaped with the roof not counting towards the total percentage, my personal opinion.
Okay, so I'm trying to decide where we are on this one. There's a lot of really good input. Commissioner Janoff, and then, wait a minute, we have Mr. Ford, and then I'll go back to you, Commissioner Janoff.
Thank you. You could do something where you still have the 20% of the site needs to be landscaping, and then allow a certain percentage of the community recreation space to contribute to that. So that if someone has a really nice roof deck, they've probably built a larger footprint to do that. So you wouldn't want to penalize them by saying you still have to have your 20% site coverage of landscaping. You might want to allow them to use some of that community recreation space up on the roof towards their landscaping requirement. And back to an earlier, I forget which commissioner mentioned this. I think it might have been Commissioner Barnett. We can put lawn further down the list, but also whether someone comes in a discretionary process or a ministerial process, they're still going to have to meet C3 requirements for water use and how their irrigation plan is using water. So there's certain requirements that they can't just put in a lawn over 20% of the site and water it. So that's already going to be restricted, and that's going to lead them towards native plantings, drought tolerant plantings and such as that for that 20% landscaping.
Okay, thank you for that. Commissioner Jenna.
Thank you. And I think Mr. Ford's suggestion is an excellent one. It speaks to being able to count the rooftop as quality space for residents without completely losing some form of landscaping or greenery, to Commissioner Tabana's point. So, whatever percentage that might be, I would say staff can figure that out, but at least retain a portion of green space at ground level, pedestrian level.
Good. Commissioner Tabana.
Thank you. Yes, I do really appreciate Mr. Ford's comments. So if I were to throw a percentage out there, I would be comfortable with, I would say no more than 5% can be counted towards the total of the 20% if they do have a living or a rooftop landscape.
Okay, I think that is a good idea to put out there. And so I'm going to ask staff if you have enough to go on with this. We have Commissioner Thomas again. So
I would just like to add, because I know that I made multiple comments and we went really in on one of them, but I just wanted to also see if we agreed that we should be able to double count, like overlap landscape space with community recreation space, because I think that those can be counted in the same way, or if that, in it, staff, you can clarify if that would create too much confusion.
Yeah, I would have the same question, but that made a lot of sense to me, and that's where I was going with my comments.
Yeah, thank you. That was actually something I was just thinking about as well. It would make perfect sense, for example, if they put in a grassed volleyball court, why not be able to count that both towards landscaping and community recreation space? Mr. Ford, I don't see an issue with that in terms of drafting the standards, but I'll defer to you if you see any red flags.
Yes, thank you. Well, as Commissioner Thomas was saying that, I just, was putting on my devil's advocate hat. And I think you just want to be careful. I mean, most architects and landscape architects have a really hard job making that number meet when they're trying to do their site plan. So a lot of the landscaping tends to be, it looks really beautiful, but it's, 10 square feet there and 20 square feet here and 100 there. So you have to make sure that if you're going to double count it, that it's actually usable as a community recreation space. So again, it might be a maximum percentage or something, that could be double counted, but I'd be careful to allow all of landscaping to be counted because it may not be usable in the sense of a recreation space.
Okay, so Commissioner Thomas, did you have, given what he just said, does it change how you feel about it?
Yes, I think that I do agree that we want to be careful. We don't want just this community recreation space to be like little tiny, like a couple square feet here and there. So maybe it can, I don't know if this is like too specific as far as objective standards go, or if we can be specific enough, but maybe it has to be the space has to be designated for a specific use, like a volleyball court or a play area or a, barbecuing picnic site or community garden, something that I would assume that a planned development would like have a specific use for. I don't know if that's legal or allowed, or we can write that into objective standards, but that would be a way that I would see a way around the issue of just divvying it up everywhere.
Okay. Mr. Safdie and then Mr. Ford.
Thank you. I'd like just to chime in. So we actually are covered on that already. 8.10.1C, there is a requirement, the minimum dimensions of community recreation space, and that's each individual community recreation space used to come up with the total, has to be 10 by 6. So there's not going to be little pockets that people are using towards that. Additionally, there are allowances for landscaping within the community recreation space. So based on the suggestions I'm hearing, I do think that it would be a fairly simple fix for staff.
Okay, to combine those. Yeah. Well, I mean, you are dovetailing onto the last comment that you called out from him, which was the size of the community recreation space to be reduced or based on the overall size of the property. But I'll go to Mr. Ford.
No, thank you. I was just going to follow on Mr. Safdie in responding to Commissioner Thomas. I would try to, in order to stay objective, I would try to stay away to a laundry list of what qualifies as community recreation space, and instead try to stick with a metric of a minimum percentage, maximum percentage, minimum size, something like that, that is just easy for the developer to put on their drawing, and it's easy for the staff member to verify when they see it, and just stay with a metric if possible.
So to that point, I'm going to ask the question, because that's the other comment that we have to discuss from this, is that the 60 square feet was huge, I think was the word that was used in the comment. If you're talking about certain size properties. So is it better to do a percent or say something like 10 by 6? Oh, Commissioner Thomas.
I think that the comment was about the private space, and we were just discussing the community recreation space.
Yeah, fair enough.
So
okay.
I think that, yeah, okay.
But I think even with that, he was just saying it was what we had in there was too high. So
yeah, for the next part, it was okay. Yeah.
Okay, but we should close on the landscaping. So what I heard though is that that because we already have protections in there about it being large enough that we could go down the path of combining the community recreation space and landscaping in terms of meeting the overall requirement. Yes. Okay. All right. Good. And I think I heard that most of the commissioners think that's okay, and we just don't want too high of a percentage of a landscape roof, per Commissioner Tabana's comment, to be considered meeting that requirement. But Commissioner Janoff still has another comment.
Sorry, is this horse dead yet? Okay. So Mr. Mayor raises a couple of other good points, and they're related to the private balcony as well as the common space, having to do with it being a percentage. He doesn't say this, but it may make sense to do a percentage or a minimum for certain sizes or certain size of a community. You know, as I say often, they're the experts in this area, and we want living space, we want recreational space, we want landscaping space that makes sense. But if a 6 by 10 foot is a gigantic balcony for multifamily unit, then let's listen to the architects and bring it down. But maybe we're bringing it down only for the smaller units. He says, you know, on the community space, just, you know, flipping back and forth. Maybe we want a different standard for a smaller building unit, say 10 to 12 units, versus one that has 20 or more units. So I think you know, sort of a sliding scale makes sense, and whether that's different sizes or different percentages, I would leave it up to staff and Mr. Ford to come up with those numbers. But I think there's some reasonability in having something that's differently sized depending upon the size of the overall project.
Sounds good. Commissioner Thomas and then Commissioner Raspy.
I'll let Commissioner Raspy go first because I agree with Commissioner Janos' comments, and my question is to do with something else.
Okay, Commissioner Raspy.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on Commissioner Janos' point, and specifically on the size of projects and the notion of community recreation space. I know during our discussions during the general plan, we put a lot of emphasis on missing middle housing. And it seems to me that those are precisely the type of projects where if we force a large either percentage or square footage requirement of community space, we're going to lose the opportunity to put adequate housing in those spaces. So I would encourage staff to come up with a minimum number of units before a threshold community space requirement is implemented. I don't know if that's 24 units. I don't know what that number is. Again, as Commissioner Janos indicated several times now, you guys are the experts and we'll look to you, but I think that notion makes sense to me.
Okay. Very good. Commissioner Thomas.
I would like some clarification because I thought Commissioner Janoff was just talking about, are you talking fully about community recreation space or were you specifically talking about the private recreation space?
I was speaking to both.
To both. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then my other.
When the architect says 6 by 10 is a gigantic balcony for a multifamily unit, you kind of want to listen to that. And so,
No. Yes, but then I just heard Commissioner Raspy mentioning more about community recreation space, not necessarily the private recreation space, which I understand that I mean, you're raising issues with both, but I just wanted clarification on that.
And my thinking was through the chair that if we had a notion of smaller for smaller and larger for larger in both private and community space, recreation space, that makes sense to me. But what those percentages for square footages might be, I'm not going to even go there. But I think it may make sense to have two different numbers.
I like your suggestion of a sliding scale because I think that that when you have higher density properties, you're not going to have the luxury of as much space, but you want to make sure there's a minimum. But that minimum might not be the same one that you have for a single family home, of course. So I don't know if staff is comfortable kind of going with that kind of feedback because I don't think we have the the ability to put numbers out there for this right now. And how much trouble would it be to have a sliding scale?
Thank you, Chair. I'll start by saying just a reminder that this really is going to be applying to larger developments, not so much the missing middle developments. And in most cases, it really is going to be people who are coming in under one of those special state laws. And so we do, as Mr. Ford has mentioned, want to try and keep these straightforward and not too complicated. We can look at reducing or modifying some of these numbers if that is the will of the Planning Commission. We've started with these particular requirements. For example, the private recreation space, that is based on what we currently have in town code. But for example, for some of these larger developments, or if it was different sized units or more units, if the commission felt that having a different threshold based on one of those criteria, I think we could look into it. I might check in with Mr. Ford to see if he has additional questions or clarification that might help us in that endeavor.
Okay, Mr. Ford.
Thank you, Chair. No, I don't. I would take my lead from you folks, partly because I'm willing to come up with new numbers, but you guys are the folks that are going to have to be willing to update your zoning code, because as I understand it, I think your zoning ordinance is already pretty clear about the minimum size of a balcony. So I don't have a problem changing that. But also, I don't know if you have a 2-bedroom unit in a 8-unit building and a 2-bedroom unit in a 30-unit building, what's the difference? Shouldn't it be the same balcony? It's a 2-bedroom unit. So I don't know if the controlling metric would be the development size, the unit count, or as the architects pointed out in their letter, you know, a studio might have a certain size of balcony, a 1-bedroom might have a certain size. But again, I only offer that knowing that town staff, I don't want to create a zoning code work for the town staff to go back and have to backfill. But I think I'm perfectly willing to look at it.
Gosh, there's a lot of different ways you can look at this. I mean, it could be that our zoning code is not thinking about multifamily, and so. But on the other hand, you know, going and modifying the zoning code is going to be a whole nother process, and we do have that situation where this is for specific kinds of projects. So with that in mind, hopefully we can come up with a resolution. Several commissioners have comments: Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Janoff, and Commissioner Tavana.
I agree with Mr. Ford that it should be based on like the square footage of the unit versus the number of overall units. With regards to a sliding scale, if we do that, I completely defer to staff about the updating our zoning code. And then my last comment, or is really a question through the chair, if it's allowed, to Mr. or Commissioner Tavana. I was just wondering about your feeling about recreation space. Is it the same with regards to the landscape space, or do you feel like recreation space can be like all of it could be on the rooftop if it's allowed, if it's community space for everyone?
You know what, I'll even though Commissioner Janoff had her hand up, I'll go to Commissioner Tavana just so he can answer your question, and if he had an additional comment, and then I'll go back to Commissioner Janoff.
Thank you, Chair. To answer your question, Commissioner Thomas, no, I personally think it should be separated, just for a variety of reasons, but just on its face, I don't see them being the same. I see landscaping, and I do see recreation space being separated. So that's my personal point of view. With respect to, and I wanted to just chime in here, with all due respect, I disagree with Mr. Mayor and his approach to his comments in section for the private recreation space and the community recreation space. I have no issue with the way it's currently proposed in the draft objective standards, and I'd be willing to support it tonight if that's the direction we want to go.
Okay, sounds good. Commissioner Janoff.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think someone made the comment earlier that most of the town's code is really written around residential or low slung buildings, land, 1, maybe 2 stories. So, we're talking about a whole different category of structure than we're used to planning around. So I wanted to make a couple of comments. I think when we talk about private recreation space, in my mind, there's a difference between ground level recreation space and balcony recreation space. And there could be a different size standard for those. Number 2, regarding a different size balcony for different size units. If you think about what that would look like on the outside, looking at the building, I think you'd be disappointed when you had a whole bunch of tiny little balconies for your small units and then bigger balcony. I mean, it could look visually confusing if you do it that way. So I don't know that that's the best approach, but I would say a standard size balcony. When you look at buildings that are multi-story, the balconies are all pretty much the same size. That's just the way it looks when you're looking at the building. And I would let the architects define that, but give a minimum. And maybe 6 by 10 is too large. Maybe it's smaller. I don't know what that number is. And then the same thing for community recreation. we've been thinking pretty conventionally about ground level gathering spaces. And so these concepts of using the rooftop and other areas, I think that makes, it could be big. It could be much larger than 200 square feet if we're going to the rooftops. And so I think the architects has given us a lot to think about, but I think it's for town. Now, I mean, given all of our comments, I think we have to think about making two different kinds of standards, whether I mean, we don't say in here that this is limited to structures that are proposed to be 20 units or more, right? We don't say that this doesn't apply to a missing middle situation. So if we do intend to have different standards for different types, then we should probably define those. And I know that that's a bit more work than staff might want, but the recreational space, the landscape space, the space, the community gathering space. I mean, those are really important features, but they're hard to get in if you don't have the space and you're trying to create as many units as possible. So I mean, it's really kind of a tough problem. But again, thinking about what we can do to encourage architects and developers to make these possible without too many encumbrances, keeping the green space for landscaping and counting the private space differently. There might also be something in here, I hate to complicate things further, but if a development is within, X number of feet or miles, half mile of a community park, an established park, maybe you can count or deduct some of your community recreation space if you are next to a park. I mean, there could be some creative ways to make this work for developers as well as the community that they're building for.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to be the devil's advocate though and say that I don't want to load up staff or our consultants with too many things. I mean, this is important, but on the other hand, I mean, my understanding, and we had this discussion with staff in our pre-meeting, this is because the architects came right out with, this only applies to these kinds of projects and not to the kind that we do. And that was verified to be the case in talking with staff, that this is for specific projects that come under specific laws from the state of California. So I would be a little bit reluctant to be starting to make it more complicated. But maybe the one thing that might be worth pursuing is deciding if the balcony size of 10 by 6 is too much. But I don't want to, I think it would be a slippery slope towards finishing this thing to add in a lot of complexity. So I'll go back to Commissioner Dennis.
Yeah, I agree. And I do agree with Commissioner Tabana that if it were to remain as written, I would personally be comfortable with it. But I would also suggest just an easy check might be, Vice Chair Barnett has referred many times to the Palo Alto code. Just do a quick check to see what communities that are building multi-story or multi-residential units, look and see what their standards are and choose that number. And if it's 6 by 10, yay, we got it right. And if it's smaller or a minimum or a percentage, maybe that's a better way to go. But I'm sure that there are specific numbers, and absolutely. I'm not suggesting we make a research project out of this, but get a reasonable number that other municipalities are using. Santa Clara is building a ton of high-rise building. I'm not saying they're all beautiful, but they probably have a minimum balcony standard, for instance, or a minimum private space, and just see what they have. And if it's nothing, if it's the same as what we have, leave ours as is.
I think that sounds like a good thing. So maybe just a sanity check to make sure that that we're not overstepping this thing based on having our standards built around single family homes. Vice Chair Barnett.
Thank you. I need some clarification. This is on page, what is this, 209 of the package, where it talks about the size of the open space, the private open space. And if I can get my arms around this. So we know that the deck dimension is 10 feet by 6 feet. but then it goes down to subparagraph double I, and it says that the above dwelling units above the ground floor shall have 120 square feet. So I'm not sure how to compare the 120 and the 160. I know I'm missing something here.
Can you take that one, Steph?
Sure, thank you. So there is minimum dimensions, trying to make sure that the size of the balcony is a usable space rather than say something that's only 2 feet deep and really long. And then you have the overall size. So if you're on the ground floor, as Commissioner Janoff was suggesting, it is a 200 square foot size requirement, whereas if it's above, it's a different requirement. It's only 120 square feet. But that 120 square feet needs to be laid out in a way that you have at least a 10-foot by 6-foot dimension. It will be bigger than that because that's only 60 of the 120 feet. Did that help to clarify? That it's about, you've got a certain amount of area that's required. And then we also are giving that the dimensions need to be at least 10 by 6 so that it is a usable space.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks
Vice
for
Chair?
the clarification.
Okay. Commissioner Janoff.
Sorry, yeah, and thanks for bringing us to this particular page, Vice Chair. Maybe this is where the problem lies, because an above ground unit with a 10 by 12, let's say, square foot balcony is huge. And maybe that should be the 6 by 10 rather than 120 square feet. You know, I'm just curious. I'm thinking about what a 6 by 10 foot balcony or 120 square foot balcony might look like. That's huge. It's really, really big for a balcony, even though you're only required to have 10 by 6 feet.
And that's as big as a lot of people's bedrooms in their homes, you know.
Yeah. So maybe what we should do is reduce that 120 square feet and just restate the 6 by 10 or say 60 square. You know, I like the dimensions because you're right, Ms. Armour, you wouldn't want a 2 foot by, 20 foot long. Well, then you're looking like a really fat belly band, so that wouldn't work. But yeah, I think that could be part of the problem.
Okay, Mr. Ford has his hand up.
So another way to look at that and how lowercase Roman numeral 2, I guess it is basically what you're seeing there is there's 2 balconies. So a unit has 2 balconies. Maybe it has one that's off the living room and one that's off one of the bedrooms. That's a potential way to do it too. You don't have to have one big, huge balcony. You could have 2, so long as each of them is a minimum size.
Okay, Director Paulson.
Thank you, Chair. So, I mean, obviously, we're hearing a lot of good conversation around a number of topics. I think ultimately, what you heard from the architects was, the 120 or the 200 square feet for a ground floor unit might be too big. And so you have this dimension versus square foot conversation that could be addressed, as Mr. Ford mentioned, in a number of different ways. We can look at other opportunities for how that is expressed in the objective standards, come up with some, 2 or 3 different options for the council to consider should this move forward today. In addition to that, there's obviously been a lot of conversation around community space, landscape space. Can one count for both? Are they exclusive? Should we exclude rooftop decks? So I think we can kind of get our arms around all those, varied topics and see if we can come up with some other options for consideration, whether that's, again, additional consideration for the commission or additional consideration from the town council, in addition to reaching out to both the architects group that we heard from, as well as the HEED member, who is also an architect, to get their further input on what they've heard tonight, because I know at least 2 of them are in the audience. And so
they've been hearing a lot of this conversation as well, and so they probably will have additional thoughts once this moves forward to council.
Right. So I think what I'm hearing is I'm going to give this direction to the planning commission that we don't want to continue this again. I mean, from our last meeting, we have been working on this for well over a year. We needed to have this thing done months and months and months ago, and we don't. And so, I'm reluctant to do anything where the staff would have to come back to us. On the devil's advocate side of that, we don't want to dump a pile of stuff on our town council either, because they expect us to ferret the stuff out and make a good recommendation to them. So I think that, but I do think that it would make sense to at least have a sanity check on the size of the balconies relative to other jurisdiction standards, to make sure that we're on target, and or check with the architects, because I think the commission, we don't have the right number for you. I mean, that's going to come from architects and others. Does that sound like a way we can go forward? I mean, because what I heard is there's a couple of things we maybe need to look into, and I think we gave some feedback on the comments. Ms. Armour.
Thank you, Chair. I just was going to take what you were saying and clarify how it would likely be presented to town council, just to show that it isn't just leaving it up to them, but that it would be providing the language that is there, as well as the different issues that were considered and discussed by Planning Commission as important topics for consideration by town council. And so I think it could be presented to them in a way that this was identified as an issue that Planning Commission recommended they consider closely with several options based on other examples or additional feedback from the architect community.
That sounds okay with me. How does the rest of the commission feel? Vice Chair Barnett.
I would put an addition to Ms. Armour's comments, and that is that before it's presented to council, that the staff and consultants be involved in this process of producing other alternatives or recommendations, so that the same discussion doesn't occur at the council level.
Yes, so that we're not like spinning our wheels. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. Staff had they had a comment on Exhibit 20, which was relative to the other public comments, and it says in their comments, the public comment in Exhibit 20 also expresses support with the information provided in Exhibit 16, 17, and 18, and additional suggestions through the purpose and applicability section. And the bottom line is staff is supportive of these recommendations and can incorporate them when forwarding the revised document to town council. I did look at the additional comments, and I thought that they were reasonable. And since I'm hearing staff thinks it's okay, I feel like we don't need to go through those comments and specifically, but let me throw it out if any commissioners want to discuss any of the other public comments. And I'm going to come back to the architect's comments after this question. Commissioner Janoff.
I'm very comfortable with staff following staff's recommendations for this set of concerns.
Good. I feel the same way. All right. Okay. So in addition, on the architect's comments, they had quite a number of comments, and in the addendum, staff did later on in the addendum go through every single one of those comments and give feedback. A lot of as mentioned earlier, a lot of the architect's comments were in fact questions asking for clarification from the document. Staff answered all of those questions. There were also some recommendations they made that they didn't feel like they didn't call out that they needed specific feedback from the Planning Commission. So my suggestion would be that unless any commissioners have any objection to that approach, that we just adopt the staff's recommendation and say that, yes, you answered the questions, and any of those minor changes that they didn't need our feedback on, that we don't need to discuss them. So, but I want to put it out for commissioners, if there's anything else in the addendum that staff commented on relative to the architects, since we did continue this meeting primarily because of their input, is there anything else that the commissioners feel that we need to discuss? Okay, good. I'm not hearing that, but like I said, I read through everything that staff wrote, and I thought it was fine, but I want to make sure that we had a chance to comment. But it is almost 10 o'clock, so I wanted to, see if we can't wrap this up soon. The only other comments were the additional ones that came from Ms. Quintana tonight in public comments, but I think most of the stuff she covered was things that we've been talking about tonight. So if that's the case, then can I get a recommendation from, or a motion from Commissioner to recommend the objective standards draft to Town Council with all of the changes and recommendations we've made tonight? Commissioner Janoff.
Yes, I move to forward the draft objective standards to Town Council, given the additions and changes that the Planning Commission has recommended to staff this evening.
Sounds good. And is there a second, Commissioner Tabana?
Yes, I second the motion.
Okay, very good. And I think we've had a very good discussion, and I wanted to make a special point of saying that I appreciate all of the great comments and feedback that have come from every member of this commission. And so I will go ahead and call the question, and I'll start with Commissioner Tabana.
Yes.
Commissioner Thomas.
Yes.
Commissioner Respi.
Yes.
Commissioner Janoff.
Yes.
Commissioner Clark.
Yes.
Vice Chair Barnett.
Yes, but I thought Ms. Quintana had a good point about the organization section where it said the following objective design standards are organized, and I think we're dealing with more than design standards. So she has a good point on that. It's just a suggestion for me. Otherwise, I do agree with the proposed motion.
I think that staff said that they concurred with her comments on that front, and that's part of our recommendation. Did I miss something? Okay,
Good.
Yeah. That was what is in Exhibit 20, and staff said we're supportive of these recommendations and can incorporate them when forwarding the revised document to Town Council. So to me, that I thought that was included.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So you're a yes then.
Yes.
Okay, and I vote yes as well. So it passes unanimously, and I will just ask staff for clarification. There is no appeal rights for this issue because it's a recommendation.
That is correct.
Okay, so thank you everyone for the great discussion on this item, and we can go ahead and go on to the last item on the agenda, which will be the, well, there's two things, report from the Director of Community Development, and then we'll have subcommittee reports.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and keep this quickly, but we do have a few important things going on right now. We did release the initial public review draft of the housing element that is available for public comment for a 30-day period ending at 5 p.m. on September 27th. And as part of that period, we're inviting written comments, but we're also going to be providing an opportunity to receive verbal comments on that draft housing element tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. at a HEB meeting via Zoom. Available information on that is available online. And then the second item that I will mention this evening is that we are moving forward with the process to institute a permanent Senate Bill 9, SB 9 ordinance. And so the first step on that is that we do look to be completing an initial draft of that would be available online by the end of this week, that we will be holding a community meeting via Zoom next Wednesday, the 21st at 7 p.m. And then we will be bringing that draft and any comments received at the community meeting to Planning Commission for consideration at the next meeting on September 28th. And that's it. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for all that. And then the last item on our agenda is, subcommittee reports and any commission matters. In addition to their service on this planning commission, every single member of the planning commission serves in an additional capacity on another town committee. And in our case of the planning commission, that includes the general plan committee, the conceptual development advisory committee, and the historic preservation committee. And in the case of the general plan committee, the format of the general plan committee this year is that all general plan committee members serve on the housing element advisory board. And that also includes some additional community members such as Mr. Mayor, as we were discussing. So I'd like to find out if there are any committee reports from the subcommittees since our last meeting on August 24th. Vice Chair Barnett.
Yeah, the CDAC has not met since our last meeting.
And the Housing Element Advisory Board has not met either. Has the Historic Preservation Committee met? Okay, so then we don't have any subcommittee reports. And I think everyone's tired, so there's probably no commission matters either. So I'd like to thank you all for your service and great discussion to help forward along the draft objective standards. And with that, we are adjourned, and we will see you again at our next meeting.